in this empty suite was more deafening than any celebratory music. I am Audrey, an architect aged 32, who spent the last decade building a legacy for a family that clearly never intended to include me in theirs. My phone buzzed on the vanity, lighting up with a Facebook notification that shattered my composure as I saw my parents along with my sister smiling radiantly at the airport terminal. They were boarding a flight to Vietnam, instead of walking me down the aisle, which made the caption underneath their photo feel like a jagged blade twisted into my chest. My mother had written, "Nothing is more important than a family-only vacation," effectively erasing me from the very group I had been financially supporting for years. While the realization of their physical absence was painful, the notification from my banking app provided the true killing blow to my heart. Those three people had systematically drained the $50,000 retirement fund I had spent years building for them, just to finance their luxury escape. I stood there staring at the screen while the reality of their betrayal sank into my bones, realizing that every sacrifice I made was met with this ultimate abandonment. My initial shock quickly evaporated into a cold, calculating rage as I gripped the lace of my dress, swearing that their dream vacation would soon become an inescapable nightmare. They had mistaken my generosity for weakness, but they would soon learn that a woman who can build a skyscraper can just as easily tear down a life. Please subscribe and hit the notification bell now to see how I turned their luxury vacation into a total financial nightmare. The processional music began to echo through a hall that was painfully quiet, where the front rows reserved for family remained cruelly empty. I stood at the threshold of the chapel alone, clutching my bouquet of white roses so tightly that the thorns nearly pierced through my lace gloves. While most brides are escorted by their fathers, I had to find the strength to walk down that long aisle toward the altar without the support of my father, Garrison. Every step I took felt like a heavy weight pressing against my chest as I looked at the confused faces of the guests who were whispering about the missing family members. Despite the searing pain of their betrayal, I kept my gaze fixed on the man waiting for me at the end of the tamjo. Standing there with an expression of unwavering loyalty was my husband Preston, a brilliant financial lawyer who had witnessed every moment of my family's exploitation over the past decade. He stepped forward to meet me halfway, taking my hand in his with a firm grip that signaled he was now the only protector I truly needed in this world. As we stood before the officiant, Preston leaned in and whispered that he would become the family I deserved, promising that we would face the upcoming storm as a united front. His words provided the anchor I needed to get through the ceremony, even though my heart was still reeling from the Facebook post I had seen just an hour earlier. Instead of proceeding with the traditional exchange of vows, I requested the microphone from the officiant to address the room full of our closest friends and colleagues. I informed everyone that my parents Meredith and Garrison, along with my sister Janelle, had decided that a luxury vacation in Vietnam was more important than my wedding day. The audience gasped in collective shock as I explained that they were currently sipping cocktails on a beach using $50,000 of my hard-earned money. I stated clearly that since they had officially excluded me from their definition of family, I would be returning the favor by removing them from my life and my payroll. This public declaration was not an act of desperation, but a calculated announcement of the consequences that were about to descend upon their comfortable lives. Once the ceremony concluded, and we returned to the privacy of our new home, the atmosphere of celebration shifted into a focused legal strategy session to dismantle my family's luxury. Preston opened his laptop on the dining table, spreading out property deeds and title documents that confirmed my absolute ownership of the suburban house where my parents currently lived. We reviewed the lease agreement for the Tesla that Janelle had driven to the airport, noting that the vehicle was officially registered to my architectural firm and could be repossessed at any moment. While my family was likely celebrating their escape across the ocean, we were systematically identifying every financial tether that allowed them to live above their means. Preston pointed out a specific clause in the deed that allowed for an immediate sale of the property, meaning I could legally sell the roof over their heads before they even touched down back in Seattle. We discovered that Meredith had been using my primary business account to fund her extravagant spa memberships and daily grocery deliveries without ever asking for my permission. The evidence of their greed was overwhelming, painted in red ink across dozens of bank statements that documented how they had treated my bank account as their personal treasure chest. I looked at the repossession orders and the house listing agreement, feeling a cold sense of resolve as I realized that my years of being a silent benefactor were finally over. Since my parents and sister decided that nothing was more important than a family-only vacation, I decided that nothing was more important than my own financial survival and self-respect. I officially authorized Preston to begin the process of locking their credit cards and reclaiming the car, knowing that their dream trip was about to end in total chaos. If they wanted to learn what it felt like to be a family of 3, they would have to learn how to survive in a world where I no longer provided the foundation for their existence. At exactly 11 o'clock that night, there were no scented candles or glasses of wine. Our bridal suite was covered instead, with stacks of bills and bank statements spread across the wooden table. Rather than enjoying the romance of a typical wedding night, I sat beneath the dim glow of my laptop screen while Preston meticulously organized evidence of my family's financial abuse. My banking app chimed and the sound made my blood run cold. A pending charge of $3,400 appeared from a luxury boutique in downtown Ho Chi Minh City. Clearly, Janelle was indulging in an extravagant shopping spree, at my expense, completely unbothered by the fact that she had abandoned me on the most important day of my life. I turned the screen toward Preston and told him my sister was buying a designer handbag with the credit card I had foolishly given her for emergencies. He studied the digital receipt and calmly suggested we revoke her access immediately before she moved on to the next jewelry store. Taking a deep breath, I navigated to the security settings of my primary account and pressed the command that would render her plastic card nothing more than useless scrap. We exchanged a determined look, knowing the lavish lifestyle I had funded for years was finally coming to a necessary and brutal end. The retaliation continued as I opened the mobile app for my Tesla, the tool that allowed me to track the exact location of the vehicle Janelle had borrowed to drive everyone to the airport. A small red dot blinked in the long-term parking lot at SeaTac International Airport, far from the house they no longer deserved to occupy. With a single tap, I activated the remote lock protocol and issued a digital command ensuring the car could never be started again with their key. I then called the towing service Preston had recommended, authorizing them to relocate the vehicle to a secure storage facility under my company's name. As the repossession was being finalized, my phone buzzed with urgent messages from Quentin, my bank manager and longtime trusted financial advisor. He was the only person outside my marriage who truly understood the scale of the wealth I had poured into my parents' bottomless pockets. Quentin confirmed that he had successfully frozen the revolving credit lines I had established for Mom and Dad, guaranteeing that their next transaction attempt would end in humiliating denial. He informed me that the bank's security team was now monitoring the accounts to prevent any manual override attempts, meaning Garrison and Meredith were officially cut off from my financial resources. To ensure their isolation was absolute, I logged into the mobile plan dashboard and located the high-speed international roaming package Janelle was using to stay connected abroad. I deliberately deactivated her roaming data and blocked international calling privileges, effectively plunging them into digital darkness. Without working internet access or a valid payment method, they would find themselves stranded in a foreign city where they couldn't even use maps or call a ride. I imagined the look on Janelle's face when she realized her precious smartphone had become nothing more than a glass paperweight, and for the first time in years, I felt true power over my own life. Preston leaned over and noted that we had dismantled their entire infrastructure of entitlement in less than an hour of focused work. We spent the remainder of the night reviewing the final house sale documents, fully aware that the people who once called themselves my family were about to lose everything they had taken for granted. While the outside world slept in silence, the digital war I had declared was only beginning to gain momentum across the ocean. I was no longer the daughter who could be manipulated by guilt. I was a woman who had finally reclaimed the labor and assets that had been stolen from her. At 7 o'clock the following morning, I finally initiated the only call I intended to make to the other side of the world. I spent several long moments watching the international connection bridge the gap between our two realities, eventually seeing Meredith's face as she sat at a lavishly decorated table overlooking the shimmering waters of the Saigon River. Meredith was currently broadcasting a live video to her social media followers, describing her expensive breakfast with a level of enthusiasm she had never once shown for any of my professional or personal milestones. Mom immediately rolled her eyes when she saw my face on the screen, complaining that I was being incredibly selfish for interrupting their prestigious family meal and ruining the aesthetic of her morning live stream. She did not even bother to ask about the wedding ceremony she had missed, instead asserting that I was a bitter person who could not stand to see her own parents finally enjoying the fruits of my hard work. Meredith was specifically obsessed with the lighting of the restaurant, claiming that my interruption was a direct attack on her ability to maintain her online image as a wealthy traveler who deserved only the best in life. Janelle suddenly snatched the device from Mom's hand and tilted the camera to showcase the mountain of designer shopping bags that were resting on the chair beside her, like trophies of their insatiable greed. She laughed at my cold expression and told me that I was nothing more than a glorified ATM whose only purpose was to fund her superior lifestyle while I stayed behind in rainy Seattle. Janelle mentioned that she had already spotted a diamond necklace she intended to buy later that afternoon, mocking the fact that I was likely sitting in a cheap office while she lived my dream life. I remained silent until she finished her entitled tirade. Then I calmly informed both of them that the black cards in Janelle's purse had already been deactivated and flagged for a full financial fraud investigation. I explained that the luxury they were currently flaunting was about to vanish because the suburban house they called home was officially listed on the market and would likely be sold within 48 hours. I made it clear that the locksmith had already arrived at the property to change every single entry code, meaning they would not even be able to set foot on the porch once they returned. The silence that followed my announcement was the most satisfying sound I had heard in over a decade of being their silent provider and financial guardian, while they treated my bank account like a personal treasure chest. Garrison tried to shout something in the background about legal rights and family loyalty, but his voice cracked when I told him that his name was not on a single document of ownership. I informed them that I was no longer the daughter who could be manipulated by Meredith's fake tears, or the person who could be shamed into submission by Janelle's constant verbal insults. As I looked at their pale and panicked faces across the digital divide, I realized that the people I had spent my entire life trying to protect were nothing more than parasites who had finally run out of a host. I told Janelle that she should probably save the leftovers from her lobster omelet because she would not be able to afford another meal once the hotel discovered their credit limit was zero. Before they could utter another word of protest or beg for a second chance, I tapped the red end call button with a steady hand. I felt a profound sense of peace settle over my soul, knowing that the cold reality of their betrayal began to fade while the chains of my obligation were shattered. On Monday morning, instead of boarding a luxury flight for a tropical honeymoon, I walked into the sleek glass offices of a premier real estate development firm with a level of authority I had spent years cultivating in my professional career. I sat across from a senior representative who was eager to acquire the suburban property that Meredith and Garrison currently believed to be their permanent sanctuary. I signed the paperwork for a lightning-fast cash transaction, deliberately choosing to offer a significant discount to ensure that the title transfer would be finalized within a mere 48 hours. This decision was not about the money I was losing on the sale, but rather about the absolute speed with which I could strip away the roof they had taken for granted while they were busy betraying me on another continent. I felt a cold surge of empowerment as I watched the notary stamp the documents, realizing that the very walls my parents had decorated with my hard-earned money would soon belong to a demolition crew. As I stepped out of the real estate office into the crisp Seattle air, my phone buzzed with a confirmation from the specialized repossession team, stating that the white Tesla Janelle had used to flee to the airport was now securely locked in a private warehouse under my name. I felt a grim sense of satisfaction knowing that when my family eventually returned to the airport, they would find an empty parking spot where their luxury transportation used to sit. They had mistaken my silence for a lack of resolve, but now the very vehicle Janelle used to display her unearned status was being held as a silent reminder that my generosity had officially reached its expiration date. This was only the second phase of my plan to dismantle the infrastructure of their entitlement, and I was just getting started with the logistical nightmare I was preparing for their arrival. I spent the following 2 hours on the phone with various service providers, systematically disconnecting every modern comfort that made that house a habitable home for Meredith Garrison and Janelle. I officially terminated the accounts for the high-speed internet, the electricity, and the water services, ensuring that the property would be dark and cold by the time their return flight touched down on American soil. More importantly, I contacted our primary health insurance provider to remove all 3 of them from the comprehensive medical policy that I had been paying for since the very beginning of my career as an architect. This was the moment I realized that I was finally no longer responsible for the physical or financial well-being of people who viewed me as nothing more than a bottomless resource for their vanity. Preston coordinated with a local moving company to arrive at the property within the hour to begin the grueling process of clearing out a decade of unearned luxury from every room. I specifically instructed the foreman to pack every designer gown, every piece of expensive jewelry, and every antique furniture item into generic cardboard boxes for immediate transport to a public storage facility on the outskirts of the city. I only authorized a payment for a single week of rent at the storage locker, which meant that Janelle and Mom would have to figure out how to finance the safety of their own belongings once that 7-day period expired. The house was being emptied of their presence just as quickly as they had emptied my heart of any remaining affection during their cruel departure for Vietnam. Finally, Preston and I met with a legal representative to formally withdraw my financial sponsorship and the guarantee of funds I had provided for their international excursion. We signed the legal documents that inform the relevant authorities that I was no longer providing any financial cushion or emergency backing for their stay in Vietnam, which effectively left them as tourists with zero backed assets in a foreign country. I looked at the finalized stack of paperwork and felt a sense of closure that no wedding ceremony could have ever provided during that lonely walk down the aisle. We were no longer just a couple on our first day of marriage, but a formidable alliance that had successfully reclaimed the stolen future my family tried to take for granted. I walked out of the lawyer's office feeling lighter than I had in years, knowing that the trap was set, and all I had to do was wait for the inevitable collapse of their stolen paradise. 3 days later, at a high-end restaurant in Ho Chi Minh City, the sophisticated atmosphere of the dining room was suddenly shattered by the shrill and aggressive shouting of Janelle as she argued with the confused waitstaff. The elegant dining room, which was filled with wealthy international travelers, and the soft sounds of a grand piano became the public stage for her catastrophic meltdown when her titanium credit card was declined for a $3,000 dinner bill. I could almost visualize the look of pure shock on her face as the waiter politely informed her that the transaction was blocked by the issuing bank for a total lack of authorized funds. Janelle screamed at the poor man, "Do you have any idea who I am, and how dare you suggest that my card is anything less than perfect in front of these common people?" The waiter simply bowed his head and replied with a firm voice, I apologize, but the system clearly says your card is blocked, so you must find another way to cover this $3,000 bill immediately. However, the result remained exactly the same as before, leaving her standing there with a useless piece of plastic and a table covered in expensive seafood that she no longer had the means to pay for. The humiliation only intensified when they retreated to their five-star hotel, where the primary manager was already waiting in the lobby with a grim expression and a folder full of unpaid invoices for their luxury stay. Garrison was immediately cornered near the reception desk as the hotel staff demanded an immediate payment of $20,000 for the accumulated room charges and high-end amenities they had consumed since their arrival. My father tried to maintain his crumbling composure by shouting at the manager, "This is an outrageous mistake, and I demand that you accept my word as a respected American businessman while we sort out this minor banking glitch." The manager looked at him with a cold and clinical gaze before replying, "Mr. Garrison, your word does not pay the $20,000 you owe us, so you will either provide a valid form of payment now or wait for the local police to arrive." The manager was no longer interested in listening to his hollow excuses or empty promises, and the threat of being handed over to the authorities became a terrifying and very real possibility for them. A wave of extreme panic washed over Garrison as he frantically pulled out his smartphone to contact the bank in Seattle, only to discover that the device was completely disconnected from any roaming network or signal. He realized in that moment that the high-speed internet and international calling capabilities I had been providing were officially severed, leaving them completely isolated in a country where they did not speak the language. When he finally managed to connect to the hotel's public Wi-Fi to check their shared emergency account, his heart must have stopped at the sight of a zero balance that reflected the true extent of my anger. Every single penny they thought they had access to was gone, replaced by a cold, digital void that confirmed I had finally followed through on my promise to strip them of my financial protection forever. The situation escalated even further when the hotel security team arrived to prevent my family from leaving the premises with their designer luggage until the entire outstanding bill was settled in full. Meredith began to scream about her rights as a citizen, but her protests were met with the stern faces of men who were trained to deal with entitled tourists who believed they were above the law. They were eventually escorted to a small and humid holding area near the service entrance, where they were forced to wait, while the hotel initiated a formal report with the local precinct. Janelle sat on a hard plastic chair with her earlier arrogance completely evaporated as she realized that her designer shopping bags were likely going to be confiscated as collateral for their unpaid room charges. After many hours of intense negotiation and the eventual intervention of the embassy, they were finally released onto the dusty sidewalk outside the hotel with only the clothes on their backs. Meredith sat on the grimy concrete curb in her expensive silk dress, which was becoming stained with the soot and exhaust of the thousands of passing motorbikes that flooded the busy streets of Saigon. She frantically scrolled through her Facebook followers and sent hundreds of messages to her online friends begging for a small loan or a place to stay while they figured out their next move. To her absolute horror, the very people who had liked her luxury travel photos just hours ago were now leaving her on read to Tran, being associated with her sudden financial collapse. They were now truly alone in a foreign land, without the protection of my wealth or the architectural foundation I had provided for them for over a decade of unearned luxury. Garrison looked at his wife and Janelle with a sense of profound regret, realizing that without my bank account to shield them, they were nothing more than three people who had traded their integrity for a trip they could not finish. My plan was functioning with a level of precision that surpassed even my own expectations, ensuring that the betrayal they showed me on my wedding day would be the final mistake they ever made at my expense. A week passed quickly as the grueling long-haul flight finally returned, three disheveled individuals to Seattle-Tacoma International Airport in a state of absolute and bitter resentment. They looked nothing like the polished travelers who had boarded that same flight just days ago, appearing instead as exhausted refugees of a war they had started themselves on the day of my wedding. Garrison led the group with a heavy and limping stride toward the long-term parking garage, clutching the digital ticket for the white Tesla that he assumed would be waiting to take them home. His eyes narrowed with a mix of confusion and mounting rage as he reached the exact numbered stall where they had left the vehicle, finding only a patch of oil-stained concrete and a pair of tire marks where my property used to sit. Janelle began to pace back and forth in a frantic search for the car, her earlier arrogance from the Saigon riverfront having completely evaporated into a cold and desperate panic. She realized that they were stranded at the airport with no transportation and nearly zero cash to hire a private driver to take them back to the comfort of the suburbs. Janelle turned to Garrison and said with a voice that was dripping with venom, "I cannot believe we are standing here like common beggars while that ungrateful woman lives in luxury after sabotaging our entire reputation." Garrison did not have the strength to respond to her bitter accusations as he realized that the disappearance of the car was just the beginning of the collapse I had meticulously prepared for their arrival. Eventually, they were forced to pool their remaining crumpled dollar bills to hire a rusted yellow taxi that smelled of stale cigarettes and cheap air freshener for the long drive back to the house. As the cab turned onto the familiar quiet street of our neighborhood, the sight of a massive red and white sign displaying the words "Sold" in bold letters sent a shock through the taxi. The driver slowed down as they approached the driveway where Garrison scrambled out and frantically tried to input his old security code into the smart lock of the front door. He realized with a sinking heart that the digital interface remained dark and unresponsive because I had deactivated the power and changed every single access code the moment the sale was finalized. Mom collapsed onto the wet driveway as she looked toward the sidewalk where dozens of damp cardboard boxes were piled haphazardly under the relentless gray drizzle of a typical Seattle afternoon. She saw the corner of her favorite silk evening gown peeking out from a soggy box that was slowly disintegrating in the moisture of the curb. Janelle rushed over to inspect the pile of their lives, discovering that their most precious designer items had been handled with no care and left to rot in the elements. This was the moment they understood that the home they had treated as an entitlement for over a decade was officially gone, replaced by a cold reality where they were no longer the masters of a palace they did not own. Just as Garrison tried to kick the front door in a fit of useless frustration, a professional security officer stepped out from around the corner of the garage, with his hand resting near his radio. He looked at the three shabby individuals with an expression of clinical indifference, as if they were just another group of trespassers trying to disturb the peace of a newly acquired estate. The security guard informed them with a robotic and firm tone, "You have exactly 5 minutes to gather those soggy boxes and vacate this private property before I am forced to call the local police to remove you for trespassing." Meredith tried to scream that this was her house and that her daughter was the owner, but the guard simply pointed to the official sale documents taped to the inside of the window. They were forced to begin dragging their ruined possessions away from the only sanctuary they had ever known, realizing that the bridge back to their old lives had been burnt to the ground by my steady and unwavering hand. The following morning, in a sleek glass-walled lawyer's office overlooking the shimmering waters of Elliott Bay, I sat across from the three people who had once been my entire world. The polished mahogany table felt like a vast canyon between us, separating my new life of freedom from the wreckage of the entitlement they had built over the last decade. Garrison and Meredith looked utterly broken, their clothes still wrinkled from the flight, and their eyes red from a night spent in a cheap motel. My father suddenly stood up and sank to his knees on the designer carpet, sobbing as he begged me to reconsider the sale of the house because they had nowhere else to go. Meredith joined him in a chorus of desperate pleas, claiming that they were too old to start over and that my mother's health would never survive the stress of poverty. I watched their performance with a hollow heart, realizing that even now their primary concern was not the pain they caused me, but the loss of the luxury I provided. Janelle was the only one who remained defiant, standing near the window and screaming about her inherent rights as my sister, while demanding a share of the profits from the house sale. She accused me of being a cold-hearted monster who was violating the sacred bonds of family, asserting that I owed her a future because I was the successful one. I waited for her to run out of breath before I calmly slid a thick folder across the table, which contained a detailed 10-year spreadsheet of every cent I had ever spent on them. I pointed to the final total of nearly $1 million, including her private school tuition, their luxury vacations, and the constant bailouts for their failed investments. I looked Janelle directly in the eyes and informed her that her rights had been fully paid out in cash long ago, and that the Bank of Audrey was officially and permanently closed for business. The room fell into a heavy silence as Preston handed me the final legal decree of severance, a document that would effectively end my financial and legal responsibility for their lives. I took the silver pen and signed my name with a steady hand, feeling the invisible chains of a decade's worth of manipulation finally snapping into pieces. My parents tried to reach for my hand as I stood up to leave, but I stepped back and informed them that any further communication would have to go through Preston's firm. I refused to offer them a single cent for a deposit on a new place, stating that the $50,000 they stole for their Vietnam trip was their final inheritance. There would be no dramatic reconciliation or second chances, because they had already chosen a vacation over my existence, and I was simply honoring that choice by becoming a stranger. The realistic aftermath of my decision was swift and unforgiving for those who had lived so long on the labor of another person. Garrison and Meredith were forced to move into a cramped government-subsidized apartment on the outskirts of the city, where the view was of a parking lot instead of the bay. Janelle found herself facing the crushing weight of reality for the first time in her life, having to work 3 separate waitressing jobs just to pay off the massive high-interest debt from her shopping spree in Saigon. As for me, I walked out of that office and felt the fresh Seattle air fill my lungs with a sense of peace that I had never known. I squeezed Preston's hand as we headed toward our car, finally ready to build a life where I was a wife and a partner, rather than a nameless source of revenue for a family of parasites. Before we conclude today's story, it is important to reflect on the deeper reality of what happens when boundaries are ignored in the name of blood. Don't go just yet, because the lessons from Audrey's journey are something we all need to consider in our own lives and relationships. This story serves as a powerful reminder that being family does not grant anyone a permanent license to exploit your hard work or disrespect your most sacred moments. We often feel a crushing sense of guilt when we think about cutting off toxic relatives, but we must realize that true loyalty is earned through mutual respect and not just a shared last name. Audrey did not destroy her family, she simply stopped allowing them to destroy her, which is a distinction that many people struggle to make until it is far too late. I believe that the most valuable takeaway here is that you cannot pour from an empty cup, especially when the people you are pouring for are busy poking holes in the bottom of it. If you were in Audrey's position, would you have had the courage to sell the house and leave your parents with nothing after such a massive betrayal? Or do you believe that she should have provided at least a small safety net despite their actions? I am very curious to hear your personal viewpoints on this situation, so please share your thoughts and opinions in the comments section below. Thank you so much for staying with us until the very end of this intense drama, and we